Hi, everybody. Welcome to our online discussion of March 20, 2015. My name is Christian Debré, and Amy Asbrook is with us. Toro Vivant Not Dead Yet is a project of the Council of Canadians with Disability to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability right opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending of life practice that discriminate against people with disability. There are many reasons to oppose the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Here are just few. It's unnecessary. Everyone has the option to commit suicide or to refuse medical care and have palliative sedation on demand, already without any modification of the law. It's discriminatory. While people without disability receive suicide prevention services, if they express a wish to die, people with disability will be encouraged and assisted to kill themselves. Choice is an illusion. If choice to die cannot be free as long as people with disability don't have the choice in where and how to live.
And that is true because of discrimination.
Safeguards don't work where these practices are legal. Safeguards do not prevent people from disability from being wrongly killed. Goal of online discussion: give a disabled people place to talk about these issues from our point of view. Recognize the effect of discrimination and our experience with the medical system. Establish our place in the debate aside from conversation and progressive.
Conservatives, yeah.
Yeah.
Because usually the debate is seen between progressives who want assisted suicide and religious conservatives who say no, but our position is really more progressive because we look at the political and social problems that underlie the reasons that people ask for assisted suicide.
So today's topics: competency and assisted suicide.
Thanks. Okay. The law of capacity sort of includes the tension between respecting a person's autonomy on the one hand and society's desire to protect the person, and that this law has evolved over a long time, and it includes, it comes from laws made by legislatures and also from court cases. In general, competency, you can think of it as the ability and the legal qualification to make a decision to do something. So there's a few terms that we have to define here. First is the ability, and we can talk about the ability to make a decision. And that means the ability to understand the relevant information, the ability to appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences, and the ability to manipulate the information rationally. So understanding the information is somebody gives you information, can you understand it? And communication access is a big part of that, and sometimes that can be a problem. The ability to foresee what the consequences are, and also to understand the consequences. To say you might die, if you say that to a 4-year-old, the 4-year-old won't really understand what dying means. You have to be mature enough to understand that dying means you're not going to exist anymore. And finally, manipulating information means to weigh the options, whether you can, you have different options. Can you make choices based on that information? The legal aspect of it is that competency is usually decided by a court. But in many cases, a doctor makes a recommendation which is approved by the court. And sometimes it can be a rubber stamp process. Rubber stamp,
talk, that's done.
Right, and that can be a problem if you know, a doctor and a family come to a decision that is counter to what a person wants or their interest, and the doctor and the court just says, oh, okay, well, you decided it, boom, boom, that's it. And finally, in general, a person is presumed to be competent unless there is a clear and convincing evidence to the contrary. So it's a fairly high standard of evidence that you have to come up with to say the person's incompetent. And the being competent depends on what you're doing. So you can be competent to enter into a contract or buy a house, or more likely, you could be competent to have a bank account but not to buy a house. Yep. There's competency to write a will, and competency to stand trial or to be a witness. Those are different standards. And in terms of making medical decisions, it's kind of a catch-all category that has widely different consequences. So the consequences to agree to receive treatment or choose among different treatments would be to weigh the benefits and the side effects. So it's not, I mean, it's important consequences, but it's not always life-threatening. Usually the probability is pretty low that it would risk your life.
Yeah, normally, as example, you could receive medication against pain and it makes you sleepy, which is a side effect that doesn't want to have, but it's relatively light as a consequence. But if the same medication give you hallucination and very bad hallucination, maybe you doesn't want it because it's too hard to suffer this these consequences.
Yeah, you can't function. Yeah. So you have to. Those are you know, pretty important decisions, but it's not as big a consequence as refusing treatment, which entails a risk of death. So if you refuse treatment, you could die.
Sorry, we just have received a question, but it is written in Chinese, so or Japanese, so we could not read it. If the person is really want to ask a question, could you write it in English or French or even Spanish, please?
Yeah. Okay. So, and also the consequences for requesting assisted suicide would be death. And so in terms of what competence you would need to make those decisions, it would be a higher degree of competence needed to decide to ask for assisted suicide, because the major consequence of that is death. And the law isn't always prepared to give you a sort of higher or lower standard. The competency assessment questions for medical treatment in sort of the traditional questions that doctors are supposed to ask somebody if they're looking for medical treatment and the doctor wants to figure out if the person is competent to make that decision, is the first asking if the person understands the current medical condition that they have, the natural course and outcome of the current medical condition. So does the person have a terminal illness, or does the person have a disability that's going to just continue on? The proposed treatment intervention. In the case of assisted suicide, obviously that treatment is to kill the person. So you have to make sure that the person really understands that this isn't relieving suffering, it is killing the person. Because sometimes people say, I just want this suffering to be over. But this isn't suffering, relieving suffering, it's killing the person.
Yeah. There's no more suffering, but there is no more people either.
Right, right. And also, you know, it can have consequences on the family, and
sometimes very bad consequences.
Right. The person needs to understand the risks and or benefits of the proposed treatment, which we just talked a lot about, and what is likely to happen if they refuse the proposed treatment. So if they refuse assisted suicide, what's going to happen? And that also is an important question. If somebody doesn't want medical treatment, wants to let themselves die, what is the consequence of refusing the treatment? And the doctor needs to know if the person can understand and appreciate those consequences and make a rational choice. And finally, the doctor needs to know if the person understands the alternatives to the proposed treatment and the risks and benefits of the alternatives. So again, if a person says, I'm suffering, I don't want to suffer anymore, first of all, in most of the laws, the doctor is at least supposed to suggest palliative care, but there's no obligation that that be provided, and that's a big problem.
Yes, this is, because in Canada, the average people who receive really palliative care is around 35%. Right. So what happened to the other 55%, 65%, sorry.
Yep, and you know, again, if the person, to decide if a person's competent to refuse assisted suicide, if they think, you know, first of all, if they don't get the information and don't get the offer of good palliative care, then they're not really getting a good judgment. Okay, so researchers Susan Block and Andrew Billings talk about a different way to evaluate if a person is competent to request assisted suicide. And this comes from a different direction. It more comes from the looking at a person from a suicide prevention direction. And because when somebody comes into a hospital saying, I want to die, they have to be evaluated for competency as well, but it's a little different how it's done. So they look at things like, does the person have physical suffering? And does the person have psychological suffering? And there's also sort of a question, can we do anything about it when you're talking about suicide prevention, because there's a prevention part to that. Does the person have an ability to make decisions? Well, that's included in the other part. Yeah. Does the person have social suffering?
Yeah, social suffering is very important in the society right now. There is many pressure points against people, like you will be put in a CHSLD, nursing home. Yeah. And some people, and a lot of people, doesn't want to be there at all.
Right.
They prefer to die at home.
Right.
And this makes a very high pressure over people.
Right. And if your family is saying, oh, you know, I wish grandma would kick off so we can divide up the estate, or if, you know, if Brother John just had a spinal cord injury and everybody's saying, oh, your life is over, you're never going to be able to have kids, you're never going to be able to do this or that, that's a kind of social suffering too, because it convinces him that his life is worthless, but that's not true. That's just prejudice talking. Yeah. Also want to figure out if the person has what's called existential or spiritual suffering. So does the person sort of wonder what his place is in life? Why am I here? Why did this happen to me? This is not fair. And I know I felt that when I was a little kid because I was blind. Why did this happen to me? And, you know, you need somebody to help you through that, because without help, it's hard to come to grips with that. And so you need to, in deciding if somebody's competent, you need to look at whether they're going through that process. And finally, you need to look at whether the person's having a problem in their relationship with the doctor. Is the doctor giving them enough information? Do they have a personality conflict with their doctor? Is the doctor ignoring them because the doctor can't heal their problem and the doctor doesn't want to deal with people that can't get better?
If his doctor take care about his pain.
Mm-hmm, exactly. If the doctor is doing a good job managing the pain or not, and that often happens. Sometimes people, oncologists, you know, cancer doctors don't know much about taking care of pain. So, you know, because they're not there to take care of pain, they're there to cure cancer.
Yeah, they could be very good at curing and very bad as taking care of pain.
Right, exactly. And another another alternative thing to look at is the assessment of what's called demoralization. And that is when people believe that they're incompetent, when they feel like they can't cope, when they feel helpless, and that life is meaningless, and they have existential despair. There's no use in living, in going on. And, you know, when we talked a couple of weeks ago about this guy, Pierre, all of those things really applied to him.
Each subject applied to Pierre.
Right. So, there were a couple of other researchers, Gregory and Catherine Hamilton, who examined suicide requests in Oregon, and they compared clinical assessment and treatment ideas with the way suicide assessment competency determinations were done. So they looked at the clinical treatment model, which applies to everyone who is suicidal, not just a certain group of people. And it thinks of suicidal feelings as a symptom of a problem that can and should be treated. So if somebody wants to kill themselves, we don't just say, oh, okay, go ahead. That's what assisted suicide would say. We have a policy for suicide prevention, which says, hey, we can help this person. They shouldn't have to die. Did you want to say something?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
You're doing well.
Yeah. They also talk about that suicide, people who want suicide or a request for suicide is a cry for help to relieve suffering. And
it's mostly what it is.
Right.
I want to die. Yeah.
Right. Well, you know, I feel so miserable. My life is terrible. I feel awful. You know, I'm suffering. But in fact, because most suicide attempts fail, and people who deal in this field say that, you know, generally a suicide attempt is a cry for help. And finally, they talk about that life is valuable and should be saved. But the assisted suicide way of looking at sort of assessment and treatment is that it applies only to suicidal disabled people who are suffering. So they section out that group of people for special treatment, and that special treatment is that, you know, you get to kill yourself while non-disabled people, they're going to get suicide prevention treatment. Also, this assisted suicide people think that suicidal feelings are a reasonable response to the person's situation. So if the person has a disability or a person has a terminal illness, which usually comes with a disability.
Yes, we understand why you kill yourself. It's very, very hard to be disabled.
Right.
That's not true.
Right. I mean, the problems with being disabled have a lot more to do with the supports that are available or not in society and the way people are treated than their actual disabilities. I mean, sometimes there's problems having a disability, but you know, a lot of it has to do with discrimination.
Yeah.
Also, this assisted suicide people think that death is preferred over life with a disability or illness. So better dead than disabled, they say. Okay. So when people do a suicide assessment, what do they look for? They look for the onset and recurrence of psychiatric symptoms, and previous and similar episodes and treatments. And again, think of our friend Pierre that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Recent stresses, and Pierre had recent stresses that he had lost his job and had much less income under the poverty line. And he also had former episodes. He had been suicidal at one point and had depression, social and economic difficulties.
Yeah, you have to.
Yep, he had those because, again, he lost his job and couldn't work.
Yeah, and he will be poor if he continues to live.
Right, exactly.
For the rest of his life.
Right. And he couldn't get help in his home that he could control and that the people would be paid adequately for their work.
And he doesn't want to go to a nursing home.
Yep, yep. He also had religious and spiritual concerns. He felt like he shouldn't be dependent and that he wasn't, as worthwhile because he couldn't work.
Yeah.
So all those were spiritual concerns.
It's applied to him too.
Right. He also looked for symptoms of depression and substance abuse, which were things that he had dealt with in the past. Yeah. You can look at medications that the person is taking for something else that might cause or worsen psychiatric disturbance. So somebody might take a medication for an anti-inflammatory, which is a steroid, and the steroid might make them irritable, or cause some judgment problems. Well, you need to take that into account in deciding whether somebody's competent. And also you need to look at cancer or other illnesses that could be causing depression or other mental problems. If somebody has a head injury, if somebody has a brain tumor, or if somebody has MS, all of those can affect your thinking and your judgment and your feelings.
Yeah.
So also you need to look at whether the person is getting good pain control and whether they feel confident they're going to continue to get good pain control. So, for example, in Oregon, at the beginning, they took account of people who were in pain, and that's why they were asking for assisted suicide. And then other people who were afraid to be in pain, and that's why they were asking. But the number of people in pain was so low that they decided to combine it with the people who were afraid. It was only 2% of people who were actually in pain.
And it is the main reason why people say we need a law to make sure that you have assisted suicide.
Right.
But it's only 2%.
Right. They use it as the main reason, but it isn't really the main reason that people ask for it.
Social things are the main reason.
Right. So whether we also want to look at the person's sources of hope and self-esteem and strength, because those can be very helpful in helping the person get back to a place of feeling good about themselves and sort of healing. And also you want to look at the seriousness and urgency of the person's suicidal ideas and whether they have the ways to commit suicide, like access to guns or deadly drugs in their house. So that's an important thing. If somebody is saying, oh boy, I'd rather die, that's different from saying, I've got 3 guns in my house and I'm going to go home and, lock the doors and put the gun in my mouth and shoot myself. That's very different. So, and finally, you want to pick up and listen for somebody that might have mixed feelings. Sometimes people say, I really want to die, but I want to see my granddaughter graduate from high school, or, sometimes people have mixed feelings about that. So you can pick up on things that, people's hesitancy to die and help them look into the future in a more positive way. So some of the treatment goals are to understand and relieve the desperation that underlies the request for assisted suicide. And that goes right along with what we talk about, which is eliminating the reasons that people ask for assisted suicide. So eliminating the discrimination, getting people services they need in the community and palliative care, all of those things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
And it's important for doctors to not become a gatekeeper and just rubber stamp people's requests for assisted suicide. Yes, you're competent because you asked for assisted suicide. You know, don't just stick to, can you understand this? Can you understand that? Can you understand? The person says, yes, 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 yes. And then you know, stamp their thing approved. That's not the thing to do. Also, doctors, excuse me, in treating somebody, you have to deal with the person's feelings of worthlessness and demoralization, and also feelings of guilt that they may need reassurance. They might say, oh, you know, I feel guilty because my family doesn't have the money it needs because I'm costing them so much money. You know, you need to tell the person it's not your fault. And, you know, this is a problem, a social problem. It's not because of you. And, you know, help the family work out other ways. You also need to help them get beyond the black and white thinking. A lot of times people who are suicidal can only think of one idea, and I want to die. That's the only solution. That's all I want is to die. And they can't see any other options. They don't want to look at any other options. And that's also why it's kind of scary that the laws allow people to refuse treatment, you know, that might make them feel better, because that feeds into this black and white way of thinking that people have. And you also want to check out if the person has complex feelings about their doctor. So if the person thinks their doctor really ought to be able to save them and make everything happily ever after, and, you know, obviously the doctor is a human person, or if the person is paranoid about their doctor. Oh, he's trying to make me take all these things, they're making me sick, blah, blah, blah. So, what? Did you want to?
No.
Oh, okay. You wanted to say something. Also, doctors need to deal with their own feelings about disability and people who have disabilities. So they need to, there's a lot of studies that show that doctors are afraid of disability and that they underestimate people's quality of life. And also, many doctors are uncomfortable with the fact that they can't always cure somebody, and that can cause them to pull away from people and make them feel abandoned. So if you look at the competency model, the capacity, the things that can impair the ability to make a decision are lack of knowledge, coercion, and mental disorder, which actually doesn't disqualify a person from being competent. So those three things, compared to all the other things I just said, you know, that's that's how it looks. It's a very different scale, and why it's important to have a more detailed look at the person when you're deciding if the person's competent. Okay, so the Hamiltons, Gregory and Catherine Hamilton, talked about the case of Michael Freeland in Oregon. And shortly after cancer diagnosis, Michael Freeland requested assisted suicide. And here's some things that we knew about him. He saw no use in treating his cancer. You know, immediately after he got his diagnosis, he wanted to die. He said he saw no use in treating the cancer. He had already tried to commit suicide many years before, after his mother had killed herself. He was a recovering alcoholic. He had surveillance cameras on his property and many assault weapons in his home. And despite all of that, despite his record of having depression and suicide attempts and everything, he received a lethal prescription without a psychiatric evaluation. And, you know, despite all that. So he had those pills. So let's look at the support provided by a compassionate care volunteer versus the assisted suicide counseling provided by doctors with compassion and dying. So the two different groups both have compassion, but one is about dying and one is about care. Yeah. So removing the means of suicide, i.e. the weapons from his house, versus providing the means of suicide, the pills. Consider Consideration of his depression versus lack of interest in his mental health history. Well, it doesn't matter, you know, he's qualified. Taking his suicide threat seriously because of previous attempts versus being uninterested in his previous suicide attempts. Providing support and arranging for mental health treatment versus believing that Freeland didn't need psychiatric evaluation and that those doctors were unaware that he was hospitalized and determined incompetent by a psychiatrist during this whole process. The volunteer arranged pain management and palliative care versus the others who offered to sit with Freeland while he took the lethal dose. The volunteer encouraged him to take antidepressant medications, which when he finally did, helped his mood and improved his quality of life and his relations with his family, while the others didn't. And also, she reminded him that she did not want him to die. And that was something, obviously, the other people didn't do. So
this is an encouragement saying to the people, I love you. I doesn't want you to die.
Right.
You counting for me.
Yeah, you're important to me.
You're important.
I care about you. I don't want you to go. Whereas, you know, the other people are saying, go ahead. It's okay if you die.
No need of you.
Right.
Die.
So in that situation, there were other doctors who were put in a bind because when he went to the hospital because he was suicidal, they were faced with a suicidal, mentally ill person who had been given a lethal prescription by another doctor. So that was kind of confusing to them because they're used to providing suicide prevention services, but somebody else gave him the lethal drugs. And what happened was they ended up sending him home and having the police take the guns out of his house, but they sent him home and didn't remove the pills. So he had the pills in his house, but he never took them. He got palliative care support and help from the volunteers. And he ended up dying naturally and comfortably because he had good pain care and good palliative care. So, did you want to make any other comments on this?
Not really. It's quite clear that life it's better value than death.
Yeah, and we don't approach this from a, you know, it's moral to save lives and all life is precious.
No.
Because our position is that if somebody really wants to kill themselves, that's their prerogative. But we're saying
they have to do themselves
right
without help.
Right. And when the government steps in to say this group of people gets to die when they say they want to, but this other group of people will get services to help them live, that's where we think it's not okay. That's discrimination.
Yeah.
So, to view our videos, because we have 1.5 years worth of videos, you can search for Euthanasia and Disability on Google Hangouts on Air or on YouTube. Also, you can, if you want to participate, you can send me an email with your email address, and I'll send you a link to join us live. For more information on the subjects that we discuss, you can go to facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet. You can go to our website at tvndy.ca. You can send me an email at info@tv-ndy.ca, or you can follow me on Twitter at TVNDY. Thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday.
Take care.
Thanks.
And see you next Friday.
Bye.
Bye.